Is Deltarune a simulation? I've been somebody who's believed in Deltarune as a whole being a simulation of some kind since the chapter 2 days. In this video, I'd like to present a case by going over all potential evidence that can point towards that. And by the end of this video, I'll do a summary in why I believe that. I wouldn't say this is a theory, this is more so just an analysis based on my observations while playing the game. I'm going to start by going through each chapter and going over everything that I know that could hint towards it in some way. Now I might miss some things, but that's to be expected. Before I begin, I'd like to say that I believe Deltarune has two stories. One is a story inside of Deltarune itself, which is everything to do with the characters in it, like the Roaring Knights, Des, Asgore, etc. You get the point. And the other one is more outside of it, being the weird route. Anyway, I'll add on to later why I believe that, so with that, let's get started anyway. Chapter 1 opens with a sequence labeled Goner Maker in the game files, which is to this day still very interesting. I believe this will be similar to Undertale, where the starting intro will get more context later on and will more so understand its meaning as the game progresses. In said sequence, the player's soul is also quote-unquote connected, which I think is pretty interesting. It's a very specific usage of words, could have been something else, but connected is the word that's being used. The first save point already has Chris's name on it. I think is also pretty interesting, because when you go there, you're overriding Chris's save with your own, which might imply that prior to the events of, well, what you're playing in Chapter 1, there were things that happened before there. Maybe that's looking a bit deep into it, but I think that's reasonable. And the thing that I find very interesting is that when you first go into a dark world, well, when you're first there, one of the first people you encounter is Rose, and to me, it feels very weird for him to be one of the first things you encounter. He kind of exists as this tutorial, but he puts you on the right path to follow the prophecy. Now, you can skip it and say you already know about it or something, if I remember correctly, but I still think it's worth noting that you encounter him and he immediately tells you about the prophecy. It feels very forced to me, if that makes any sense. The Eggman rooms, I don't want to talk about them too much here because I don't really believe they actually relate too much to the overarching story as a whole, but I think it's interesting how hidden they are, especially in chapter 1, 2, and 4, where you have to keep walking between a specific series of rooms, as if it's, you know, it's not intended to be found in the first place, but by doing this, you kind of break the game, and you encounter something that you're not supposed to see in the first place. And something that I don't really think there's too much else in the first chapter that hints towards it, but something I think is pretty interesting is that almost all characters in Hometown are present in Undertale, which I think that could just be a choice. I don't think it's impossible, but there might be something more to that. I always thought it was a weird thing. I feel like making new characters shouldn't be hard, to be fair, but when you look at it from the angle that maybe these characters were put in because Gaster just, I don't know, he put in characters he knew from his world. So he put in Asgore, for example, he put in Toriel, which makes sense why they're there. I don't think it's super relevant, but I do think it's worth mentioning that at least. Moving on to Chapter 2. Noelle is implied to be good at breaking games in ways not intended. I feel like this is a pretty on-the-nose parallel to Noelle, you know, breaking the game known as Deltarune. You need her to be able to break the game, to see a route that you're not intended to see on your first time playing, at least. While we're on the topic, Deltarune doesn't let you actually kill enemies like in Undertale. There could be a variety of reasons for this, but it's notable anyway. Personally, I think it might be a built-in failsafe. In Undertale, killing enemies led to you eventually pretty much wiping out the entire underground. You know, by killing enemies, you got stronger. In this game, when you attack an enemy and deplete their health, they flee most of the time. I just think it's a built-in failsafe, personally. You gain more HP, but it's not like you're getting... Small side note that I realized during editing, you do gain stats from enemies that isn't just HP. You also gain attack and magic, but my point is just that it's not as much as in Undertale. Now, at the start of Undertale, it is kind of slow as well, but as you go on, it gets more exponential, and you just start one-shotting enemies everywhere. My point is that it's the amount you get is way smaller. It's just my point, okay? Another thing that maybe would have been better mentioned in Chapter 1, but I'm mentioning it here because I feel like this is where most people started getting more aware of the set character, and I don't really remember if they're in Chapter 1 to be honest, but probably are. Friend in the game files being called a device friend is very interesting as well, because a device implies there's something, you know, they have a purpose. It didn't have to be called device friend. They could have been called friend or something, or NPC friend, anything, you know, really. But it being called device friend is, you know, as Gaster would say, very interesting. Then we go on to the Light World section with Onion implying they heard a song and that it wasn't new. I don't have too much on this currently. This is the last correction in this video like this. Anyway, I actually do believe I have some clue where it's from. I believe that the world of Deltarune, right? Or hometown as a whole, is like a sphere. And once you start moving close to the boundaries of that sphere, you start getting pulled out, or you start hearing things that are not from there. So Onion, at the edge of the world, starts hearing things that are from the world of Undertale, right? And that's, I don't know why it would not be a new song. Maybe it's used somewhere in set simulation, and I don't know, Gaster likes to jam to set song, but it's just an idea anyway. Too much to say on this chapter, not to, you know, drag on time, but I feel like this, out of all chapters, even though this is where the Weird Route starts, is the one I probably have the least to say on. I mean, most of the things are pretty on the nose with the Weird Route, how you access it, but I don't have too much to say about the rest on this chapter. Moving on to Chapter 3, the sword game is pretty clearly mimicking the Weird Route, but it's interesting that the original boards tend to make you play only have one ending. Now, so do the other boards you play for the Shadow Mantle, but there you have the option of violence. Whenever you try to do something in the boards Tenna makes you play, you are immediately put back on the Weird Route, something you're not supposed to see, and then it gets blocked off, and I think that's interesting. You know, the more you start doing things you're not supposed to, like in the other boards, the more the game starts to break. Now, I will say it's a pretty clear parallel to the Weird Route, but I still think it's interesting. In the sword game dungeon, there is a theory, I forgot what it's named, but it does exist, that it proposed that the layout of the dungeon itself is mimicking Hometown, which I think is interesting, and I don't know if it's meant to be used in this context, but I'm going to use it in this context anyway for a second. I think it would make sense that, yeah, this is the entirety of Hometown, because another interesting question is, how big is this simulation? Now, I know the technology, if I remember correctly, in Undertale is pretty advanced, but, you know, there has to be a limit to how advanced it can possibly be, right? But let's say the simulation has a scale, right, a limit at one point. I feel like for the quote-unquote light worlds, you know, it wouldn't be too much. All you really need is Hometown, and that to me sounds pretty believable. I feel like, why would there have to be anything outside of Hometown? You have Hometown, and in Hometown you have Dark Worlds. That is already a pretty big scale by itself. Now, even though, if Hometown is everything, there's a limit on how many Dark Worlds you can get, right? But still, it's big is the point I'm trying to make. And I feel like having more outside of Hometown isn't really necessary as a whole. And I'll get into later as to why I believe that, but I'm just adding on to some things here. Another thing I think is interesting is in the battle with Rooksol's card, he interacts with the menu, so does Lancer. And for gameplay purposes, I wouldn't look too deep into this because it's probably just meant to be for fun. Because, you know, not everything in this game has to be taken super seriously. Sometimes things are just meant to be for fun. But I do think it's interesting that these darkness can just interact with the menu like that. I don't really see people talk about that all too much. And mostly it's being thrown up to like, oh, he's the rules card, you know, maybe he can make up the rules. But I do think it is quite notable. Moving on to Chapter 4, I don't have much to say on this chapter, so I'll keep it brief. We know the meaning behind the Shadow Crystals ever since Sean has told us in Chapter 5, but I still think there might be a bit more behind them. We already had some unique dialogue if we used them at certain places. Now, I don't remember all of them out of my head, but I'll put them on screen if you're interested. But the ones I think I remember is that Susie looked at you scornfully, you thought you saw Undyne encased in ice, and the one that's relevant to what we're talking about here is that the prophecy's text doesn't warp in the crystal. This might reflect what another route looks like, and I think the scornfully and the encased ice part would make sense, because I don't know what's going to happen in Chapter 6. I think it's hard to say certain, but seeing as there's probably not going to be a weird route for that chapter, if you skip all of Chapter 6, maybe then Undyne would be encased in ice, you know. We never know, maybe we save her in Chapter 6, this could happen. And the other things, Susie looking at you scornfully, I think, you know, the way Chapter 6 is going, I think, or the weird route is going, I think that would make sense in Chapter 7 weird route, potentially. But anyway, besides that, Chris's behavior, in my opinion, also makes a lot more sense if you believe it's a simulation. Besides the story of Deltarune, which maybe they've already gone through this frequently, which is why they act the way they do. But they still clearly care to some degree, seeing as they kick you around in the weird routes in the bucket. Now, to be fair, that was a pretty extreme set of actions what happened before there, so I could understand. But, you know, I feel like Chris, to me, looks pretty numb to a lot of stuff. But they, you know, this scene clearly still implies they care, and that they're, you know, they didn't want this to happen. So, but anyway, I don't have much more to say on this chapter. On to Chapter 5. I have a lot to say here. I'm not gonna re-record this audio like 50 times, so hopefully I just get it correctly the first time. Anyway. Gasser's top hitman, normal NPC. He's a weird character in general, but he's very suspicious. In Undertale, he looks very similar to an NPC that's a goner, almost pretty much the exact same. And to me, he kind of exists in the same role as Friend, where he's this character that, you know, exists to make sure everything goes as planned. He also slips up. Well, I thought it was maybe at first just a reference, but he kind of slips up at one point where he says it's only 2G, and G is only a currency in Undertale. And it's also thought to be that he killed Onion, because Onion knew too much, so... And it might put you on another path that wasn't intended for you to be on in the first place. Sans asks on both routes to draw your friends on a card. On the weird route, you draw Ralsei. On the normal route, you draw Noelle. I mean, I think that speaks for itself. If you believe it's a simulation, it repeats over and over. Then on the weird route, him drawing Ralsei, I don't think is that weird, to be honest. Ralsei and Flowery directly talk about the config menu, and it also has influence over what happens. Ralsei can't talk if you mute him. Flowery can't use voice clips. This is, you know, just more evidence that I feel like there is some sort of simulation. You can actually influence how these characters act based on the settings you decide to play the game with. Ralsei talks about another layer seriously before he gets cut out by Susie. I think this is a major hint. I don't see Ralsei to be the kind to make a joke about something like this. It would just cut out by Susie saying, oh, I already know about that. Which, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really feel like they do, and it was just another topic they were thinking about. Crackpot theory, but now that we know the meaning of the shadow crystals, maybe they represent more than we think. They are the crystallization of lost dreams. A lost dream in this case is something that can't or couldn't be achieved. If you look at most holders, I think inside the simulation, their path will be pretty set every time. Not that with other NPCs this isn't, but think about it this way. Jevil is trapped. He essentially can't get free. Spamton feels lost. The Knight, I'll be honest, I don't really know, but, you know, point is, they might be stuck on a predetermined path, I guess, that they're always fated to battle. Gerson is already dead, and Pink is a ghost inside a world of the living. I think this is a bit of a reach, but throwing it out there anyway. Another thing that's interesting is that the Knight cuts through Flowery's fake statistics. This implies that Flowery figured out how to edit their stats, even if they're not real. When they're doing 999 damage to the Knight, they just cut through it and make it 0. Noelle's entire exposition dump saying she feels like Noelle doing Noelle things and that people are walking on predetermined paths without thinking where to go. I mean, this feels pretty clear to me. You know, Noelle does Noelle things because she is Noelle. That's just how she's programmed, I feel like. And now that she thinks about it, it's, you know, she looks at it at a different view. Also, she's saying she wants to go to a place no one has ever gone before, being the other side of the lake. I don't think this is meant to be taken super seriously, but the way I view the world of Deltarune, if it is a simulation, is that it's like a bubble. There is no outside, because once you step out far enough, out of hometown, you step out of Deltarune. So technically speaking, no one has ever gone there before, because there is nothing outside of hometown. Although, you know, it is implied Azrael went to college, but I personally doubt this. And the most damning of all, and the entire reason that I'm even making this video, partly, is because the weird route ends on a CRT monitor saying, insert chapter 7, side B. You know, being upfront, there was, to me, almost no reason. If it was just something else, right, they could have just, as good, just on-screen them in the Deltarune font set, continued in chapter 7. But it says, inside chapters, insert chapter 7, side B. This implies it's something you have to, you have to put in to be able to play it. And then it's on a CRT display. I mean, this is just an experiment, right? This has to be super clear, I feel like. So, yeah. Sorry if this part is a bit all over the place. It was a lot of notes I had to go through. And I don't feel like doing this part 50 times over, so... Here's some extras. I wasn't sure where to fit these, or they would make already long sections longer than they should be. Ralsei existence being implied by Flower to be an impossibility. If a Darkman can only spawn from an object in the light world, maybe Ralsei isn't related to any object, and that's why he's an impossibility in the first place. Or he could just be, some form of Azrael. I mean, again, his name is an anagram. I cannot right now speak why he would be some form of Azrael, but again, Flowery implies he is an impossibility. He acts a lot like a guide as well. He wants the prophecy to not happen, but his role within the story is the guy that gets us through it, kinda. It's also where he shows up in the first Dark World. And he just moves around easily as well between Dark Worlds, I feel. Various times Gaster, or at least very heavily implied to be Gaster, speaks inside the game or outside of it. Is interesting. I don't really have an explanation for the outside of it thing, but frankly, I just think that's to generate hype. The times he's speaking inside the game, to me, more so feels like a mad scientist. Like, he's observing his experiments. He's like, oh, interesting. Yeah, this is quite interesting. He's just giving small commentary over it, Des or some other character talking to us from the inside code of the game. Yeah, talking from the code is pretty interesting, right? I feel like that has to mean something, but at the current moment, I can't really say too much about that, I feel like. The menu, or where you select which chapter to play, is interesting to me. The noise in the background feels odd, and you can start anywhere you want. Now, Toby Fox did say that this was for if you already owned the game somewhere else, but I feel like there might be more to it than that. If you ran a simulation, and it went over and over, it would be logical that you can start at any point if the events repeat themselves anyway. And that's also why I feel like the weird route has to happen early on. I mean, you cannot do the weird route if you start in chapter 3, because it's just the events leading up to it is just not possible to do there. So to me, the fact that there's like chapters selected, it just feels more like, you're starting up a simulation, you're starting up a game, and you select from where you want to begin, right? And that's to me why I feel like it's this way. The game probably could be its own thing. Maybe there are outside reasons, but to me it just feels that way. Deltarune is a simulation/experiment by Gaster in which hometown is the basis for the world. There is no place outside of hometown, and it would also to me explain why so many characters in Deltarune are from Undertale. Now, he did say it was a parallel story, but there are some unique characters in the game that aren't in Undertale. Although it's mainly Chris and maybe Susie, Susie is only implied to exist by a goner in a later version of Undertale and isn't ever mentioned outside of that. Ralsei is a character implemented to guide the heroes of the story on the correct path. He knows a lot, but not everything. At the same time, he's implied to be an impossibility by normal circumstances by Flowery, and it also explains why he knows about the battle menu and conflict menu, although Flowery does also, and maybe most Darkness do, since Ruxel Scarred also interacted with it, so I don't know how to feel about that. To add on to that, there seem to be a few NPCs in the game that exist to make sure everything goes as followed. A normal NPC potentially shut Onion up by killing them because they were about to tell what they discovered to Chris, which might have led the player to following a different path. Also notable is that said NPC is one of the few goner characters in Undertale. Maybe they went goner because Gaster doesn't exist anymore in Undertale. Friend's role at the current time isn't super clear, but he does appear in every chapter observing the player. Noel, again, is implied to be good at breaking games. It would contrast well why we need Noel to break the game by the weird route. You can't kill enemies in Deltarune, maybe as a failsafe, but you can freeze them, which probably wasn't accounted for. Toby has implied multiple times for there to only be one ending with question marks. I believe that this is because if you end the game on a normal route, the game will just restart over and over. But eventually, those playthroughs will turn into a weird route, which will end in only one way, that being the one ending that is implied. Susie in the Gerson battle says if she could choose an ending, she wouldn't choose one, and she would keep the story going. Susie, prior to the events of Chapter 1, always felt like an outsider, and now that since Chapter 5 she truly has found a place she would call home, she probably would not agree with the actions Chris is taking in the weird route or the player. Even if she doesn't remember, she would probably hold out hope for another ending, one in which the world of Deltarune continues without being stuck repeating the same events over and over. The cards you give to Sans in Chapter 5, I think it's more likely for him to have the one with Ralsei. Also because I think that one is forced and the Noelle one isn't, although I'm not 100% sure about that. But anyway. But also he gives you bread in that, which is kind of weird. Why does he give you bread? Now if you go and check the bread item, it says it leaves crumbs wherever it goes. I think what will happen is that Sans will probably follow you into Chapter 7. This implies though that Sans is a character that didn't exist in Undertale, same for Papyrus, and that the weird route will end with a few of the characters breaking free. Sans also has a weird machine in his back room, which we never know what it is for currently. And during his fight, he says he already gave up trying to go back a long time ago. Maybe he tried to go back to Deltarune with the machine, but just wasn't possible. A goner in Undertale says that Gaster was swallowed by his creation or fell into the core. Personally, I think the latter is really stupid. He's supposed to be the royal scientist, you know, he's supposed to be really smart. And you're telling me he fell into the core? It sounds really dumb to me, but both can be true at the same time. I think what it means is that he was swallowed whole by his creation, the Dark Worlds / the simulation experiment he's doing. He became really obsessed with it. And who knows, afterwards, he might have fallen into the core. It could be that in Chapter 7, you escape out of the simulation and that you fight him, and then that's how he fell into the core in some way. What Gaster wants to do with the simulation, frankly his motives are beyond me. But I'm going to assume that it has something to do with determination or the soul, since in the night fight he says something about your soul shining bright, even though you should be predestined to lose. Lastly, the weird route ends with a CRT monitor, which is a very specific choice, saying insert Chapter 7 side B. It didn't have to say insert, it didn't have to be on a CRT monitor, but it is. So do with that what you want. I don't want to waste anyone's time, but I'm just going to summarize the summary in a easier fashion one more time, because some of that might have been pretty disjointed. Hometown is the only town in Deltarune, a simulation made by Gaster to experiment with determination of the soul. Ralsei and other particular NPCs exist to make sure the prophecy is followed and that you, the player, and other important characters don't find out too much. There are failsafes within Deltarune, such as not being able to kill enemies to break the game from there. It's why you need Noelle to access the weird route, because freezing enemies isn't the same as killing them. The game loops and certain characters might retain their memories. It would also explain to me Chris's motivations better, although you could say that has more to do with the story that's happening inside of Hometown than the entire story of Deltarune as a whole. Susie will oppose the player / Chris in the weird route. Ever since she found a home in the Dark Worlds, even if the odds are slim, she would choose doing it over and over, hoping for a happy ending, instead of whatever the player is trying to do by ending Deltarune. Chapter 5 Weird Route ends with you and Noelle breaking away from the world of Deltarune, and is why the text shown is specifically on a CRT monitor. It could have been anything, but the choice for a CRT is very interesting. And that's it. That is my, I guess, recap / theory, although I wouldn't really call it a theory because I feel like theories, they're more conclusive, I feel like. I'm just drawing, you know, the first half of this video, I'm just looking at things that happened throughout the first 2 chapters that might hint toward it being a simulation in some kind, right? And then my conclusion is just drawing from those things, why I believe certain things will play out, and from every standpoint currently, to me, it feels more logical for the game to be a simulation, right? Because I feel like when you go out of the lake, you get out of Deltarune, Hometown. There is no town beyond Hometown, so you just get out of it. Now, there might be some things that are a bit unexplained, like, I don't remember if Azrael ever calls you, but if he does, I mean, that could just be a program, you know. End of the day, these are just my beliefs, and, you know, nobody can tell what this game is going to hold, except, I guess, the developers. Whether this theory ages like wine or it ages like milk, we'll see. I just hope it was at least enjoyable because, you know, I feel like even if it's not the best video, I feel like it's easy to tell a lot of people, including me, are very passionate about this game. And We just like sharing our thoughts about it. So whether you've been a long-time fan or you just found this video by randomly looking, you know, for me this was also fun to make, although some parts were a bit annoying to do over and over again, but you know, it is what it is. So anyway, if I missed anything, feel free to let me know. I'm up for discussion at all times. You know, if I miss something that completely destroys everything I said, you know, everyone makes mistakes. But I hope this was fun anyway to watch. So, you know, see ya.